Great. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 5th public event in UCL's Disagreeing Well series. My name is Julie Norman. I'm an associate professor here at UCL, and it's my absolute pleasure to be your host and moderator for tonight's conversation. Our event tonight is part of UCL's flagship campaign program on Disagreeing Well, which, as many of you know, really leans into the role of the university in furthering civil discourse, not only for students, but for staff and for wider communities as well. And that doesn't mean always agreeing with each other on everything, certainly not, or trying to find consensus, but more just trying to approach different topics with an open mind, a willingness to listen, and a willingness to consider different viewpoints. So our event tonight is, as you all know, on reporting conflict. I think we'll have a fascinating conversation exploring some different questions on really the media's role in covering some of the most difficult and controversial wars, conflicts, et cetera, in our world today. How do journalists do that with fairness, with independence, with impartiality? What affects those decisions, and how is that changing in our very polarized digital age of the moment? To discuss this topic, we have three excellent journalists with us this evening. Raghi Omar from ITV, he's the international affairs analyst, and many of you, I'm sure, have seen him on television many times. Fiona O'Brien, the UK Director for Reporters Without Borders, an absolutely essential organization at all times, but certainly in these days in protecting press freedoms and protecting journalists. And Jeremy Bowen, the international editor for BBC, who also many of you, I'm sure, have seen, and also a very proud UCL alum, which we're delighted to have him back on campus today. On these events, we do try and keep as interactive as possible. So the way our event will work, I'll be in conversation with our panelists for the first part. We'll take a few expert questions from some special guests in the audience, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. For audience questions, we ask that you submit your question on Slido. The QR code is up behind us on the slide. So you can enter your question there. Or if you don't want to ask a question, you can upvote other people's questions that you would like us to try and get to before the evening is over. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn to our panel. And I'd like to start with a general question to all of you. I mean, you have reported from conflict zones all over the world. I think we have over 100 countries represented in your reportage between the three of you. I'm curious, what was the most challenging conflict or country for you to cover in terms of being able to cover it fairly? And what kinds of dilemmas did you face in that? So whoever would like to start us out, I'll maybe come to you first, Jeremy.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I covered a variety of wars and other kinds of civil conflicts over many, many years. My first one, and to answer your question directly, I think that the degree of difficulty varies for a number of things. First of all, not just the nature of the place, the conflict you're dealing with. It's also varied over the years because the level of experience that you have. I mean, my first war was El Salvador in 1989 when I was working in BBC's Washington office. And very unexpectedly, I got sent down there. There was a big upsurge in the long-running civil war. And, you had no idea what to do. I was a little bit experienced, but I was still very much in the nursery slopes. And, I was in the place I was staying in Washington, I was thinking, well, what should I even take with me? We didn't have things like flak jackets. So I packed my trainers because I figured I'd be running. That was about it. And so over the years, and then, I mean, I was bowled over by the excitement of it. It was like being in my own war movie, which I realized quite quickly was a fairly, asinine response on many levels. And so through the years of, the first Gulf War in 1991 and former Yugoslavia, particularly over the 90s, I realized that the only reason for covering conflict is to tell people about what's happening and tell people about the lives of those people you're reporting on. And even though on a level of, there's a lot of personal challenges involved as well because of dangers and difficulties, which I'm very happy to go into if you want, and all sorts of challenges. And I think, though, of course, I have spent many years covering the Arab-Israeli conflict. I first had my first assignment in Jerusalem in 1991. I was based there 95 to 2000. I was the BBC Middle East editor from 2005 through till about 3 years ago. And when I became international editor, I took the Middle East with me. So there is no other Middle East editor. I'm still basically still that person. And is the current iteration, the Gaza war, there were other things that were really difficult. I mean, Grozny in the mid-90s, well, when was it? Yeah, mid-90s, 94, 95, was just unbelievably dangerous, unbelievably dangerous. And we were right in the middle of it, and the Russians were shelling. It was appalling. But the thing I think that the current Gaza war is very difficult to report on. A major reason for the difficulty, and which actually sometimes makes me think that we are failing as journalists, however hard we try. We're only doing half a job. A major thing is the lack of access to Gaza, which the Israelis have adopted as their media strategy, and it's pretty effective because it means that a lot of things that should be very heavily ventilated and reported are not being so, despite the sterling efforts of really courageous Palestinian journalists, many of whom are very inexperienced. A lot of the experienced people who worked for foreign broadcasters were evacuated. We had about 12 guys working for us. And with their families, by the end of the first, sort of by the early months of, about like 4 or 5 months after it started, they were all out. They all wanted to get out. We helped them get out. So we work now with trusted freelancers. They're young guys, and for all their efforts, nothing really beats having the people on the ground who. So long answer, short question. That is very difficult. Plus, of course, it's massively toxic. It's incredibly divisive. It's not my phrase, but it's a good one. I think Thomas Friedman of the New York Times once said, if you are going to be reporting or talking about the Middle East, then you have to assume that half the people in the room are going to hate you, whoever they may be. And I mean, I'm well used to that. Like most people who spent years covering it, I'm pretty confident that what we do is good. But I really think it's impeded by Israel's decision not to allow free reporting.
Thank you. Fiona.
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about my personal experience in a sec, but just to pick up on that with my RSF hat on, I think it's unquestionable that the conflict in Gaza right now is the hardest for journalists that probably there ever has been. I mean, nearly 200 journalists have been killed, Palestinian journalists, in the last 18 months. And it's not just the targeting of journalists, but it's also stopping organizations like ours from getting equipment in, things that journalists need, like batteries and flak jackets and food and water. We're not able to get those things to them. So access is very difficult. Like you say, the unprecedented blockade on external journalists coming in, so the bombing of facilities that journalists are using. So that undeniably is a very difficult conflict. Taking it back a step and thinking sort of the conflicts that I've covered, I also had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I was based in Nairobi as a 21-year-old and asked to get on a flight to Burundi where there was a civil war, and I learned quite quickly. I think every conflict you cover has different challenges. Often it's really banal, prosaic things like access, or where am I going to eat today, or there's no toilet to use, or I can't wash my hair, or really practical things.
Not an issue for me anymore.
But yeah, I think often the really boring, it's the least glamorous job in the world in lots of ways. I think for me, personally, the most challenging conflict I covered was the Iraq War. And for reasons that I didn't expect. It was very dangerous, but that was expected. It was huge in terms of the media circus was around it, which was also expected. But I think it was the first time I came across a story where the power in who told the narrative was so imbalanced. Access became harder and harder during the occupation. And, a year in, there were very few places we could get information, and they were all the same people. So it became increasingly difficult to do our job, which is absolutely to tell the story as it is. And I think the other thing that I found really difficult about covering the Iraq conflict and really made me question the role of journalism in conflict zones and beyond was the volume of media. So previously I'd been based mostly in East Africa and Central Africa and covered conflicts where when you were reporting on the story, you were probably possibly on your own with a small team, possibly just a few teams there, but you had no doubt in your mind why you were there, that if you weren't covering this story, the news wouldn't get out, that these people wouldn't be known of or heard from. Whereas in Iraq, the opposite was true. There were hundreds of us. Competition became a big factor. So rather than going out and finding out what was happening, you were getting calls from your editor saying, so-and-so is running this story, why aren't we? And that against a backdrop where it was really dangerous for journalists. I lost a lot of colleagues in Iraq, and so the two together didn't seem to be a mismatch to me. I started questioning why we were there when so many people were there doing the same thing.
Thank you.
I would just echo everything that sort of Jeremy and Fiona has said, but I think the most difficult stories I've covered are the ones where you have had to live as a foreign correspondent. I mean, Jeremy and I first met when he was Middle East correspondent in Jerusalem, and he took me to his sort of house in Ain Karam. But separating your life and reporting on a war on your doorstep, whilst you've got children growing up there, you've got partners, makes it incredibly difficult. Separating the personal from, well, they're two very personal sort of things. You're protecting your family, but then you're having to just get in a car and drive 30 miles away and report on. And then also, you have colleagues, you see their children grow up, cameramen and women, sound recordists, picture editors. You get to know each other, you bond very well, and then suddenly you leave. And I think that's the most sort of painful and difficult sort of thing, is that, and it's a great privilege being a foreign correspondent. It's a sort of dying breed where you have news organizations who are able to give you the resources to live in the society in which you're covering. So I went to, as a junior reporter based in Amman, in Jordan, reporting a little bit on sort of Iraq. I was eating off the breadcrumbs of Jeremy's table, flitting over to Jerusalem a little bit.
With the bread rolls.
You were very generous with the bread rolls. But then I went to live in South Africa, only 6 years after that it was illegal for a black and a white person to be in, having a cup of tea. And I think probably in terms of danger, I'd probably have to say Congo was the most sort of, because it's so vast and you really are on your own, I found. Of course, Iraq was a sort of, seismic event for me in terms of my sort of career, but we had an enormous amount of infrastructure. The whole Western media world was sort of, there, and you had backup. I found Congo was a truly, it still is, a huge, blighted story that doesn't sort of get on, and that's what sort of draws you back. But you really are on your own there, and that's the thing I found most scary.
Yeah, and Raghi, I might just stay with you for a minute. I know you've spoken before, like Fiona, about covering Iraq, about who is telling whose stories, and in hindsight, the need for more civilian voices and civilian stories to have been told. And I think you've all touched on that to some degree. And I guess one thing I'm curious about is, how do you as journalists who want to ensure these personal stories are told, maybe even feeling a moral imperative to tell particular stories, how do you balance that with what some see as a professional obligation for objectivity, for balance in these conflict zones where you're seeing very clearly suffering victims, people who are not in a symmetric balance sort of situation to have their stories told?
I mean, the only thing I'd sort of say is the privilege of, being at the center of a story like Iraq or, the Middle East or Congo, is that sometimes when you are one of a few number of sort of people that are there to report it, you can drive the agenda a little bit. When head office says, well, this has ended up on CNN and that's ended up on sort of BBC, and say, well, hang on, sorry, I've gone with my colleagues and we've filmed this and that's the story you're getting tonight. And sometimes that's how you get those sort of human stories on. It's not a giant game of Snap, as sometimes reporting from Washington or Westminster can be. The head office sort of dictates, well, that's what we want tonight. But with you,
I'm so old. But when I started, there was no instant communication.
Exactly.
You had to sometimes, if you could find a telex to communicate with 19th century technology, you would do what you felt was the right thing.
Yeah.
And I mean, what is very different now for younger, and by younger I probably mean most people under about 50, because they've been operational in the period of mobile phones and data roaming and all that sort of stuff. I mean, when we had the first satellite phones, which weighed about 75 pounds and were incredibly expensive and mostly didn't work, that was extraordinary, because I've been used to going to countries where you couldn't talk to anyone. And so I personally, and also I've been doing it a long time, and so it's probably easier for me, but I decide what our story is.
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't get told what the story is going to be. I'll willingly have a discussion. And I've been like this for quite a few years now, and many years. I was a graduate trainee at the BBC, and from day one, they said to us, the reason we have foreign correspondents, if that's what you end up becoming, and I wanted to be one, is that they're there to tell us what happened. It's not us telling them what to do. And of course, there were the practicalities of it, which in most countries then, they couldn't. So yeah, I think that what I would say to younger colleagues is that you call it. You're the person who's there. You're the person on the ground. You're the person who's ideally, and of course Gaza, we're barred from doing that, you can use your own eyes and your own ears here. And they're the most important news-gathering tools that you have. And talking to people and seeing things, you can learn more, I think, in half a day somewhere than you can learn in a week staring into a computer screen. And so, yeah, I think that it's good to discuss, good to advise, good to discuss durations, content. We always have a row about the gore factor in a piece, normally. I've been having those for many decades now. And I always want more, they always want less. We get somewhere in the middle. And no, I mean, I feel very strongly that there is no point in paying people like ourselves to go abroad and report if you don't listen to what they're saying, if you tell them what to do. Well, there's a really interesting story in The Guardian today. I don't give a damn about what is in. And as I've got older too, we should never really think about what the so-called opposition are doing. You should do what you think is right. Give it your best shot every day. You might be wrong. You might get beaten hollow by the opposition, but at least you've done it your own way. You should not be second-guessing. That's madness lies down that road. I'm telling you, as a journalist, you have to do your own thing and have some conviction about it.
Yeah, there's never been any doubt in my mind that our primary role was to talk to, in a conflict situation specifically, was to tell the civilian story. The other stories get told. These days, we're not even really needed as journalists because those in power can communicate directly with the public in all sorts of other channels as well. I was very lucky in Iraq because I was there specifically to cover the civilian story because I was an Arabic speaker, so I was brought onto the Reuters team to do that side of things and was sent out to tell those parts of the tale. And yeah, I think that's absolutely right, that's what we're there to do. I don't think, though, that that's what always happens because there is a massive pressure on journalists, increasingly in this technological age, to report quickly, to get news out fast, to report 24 hours a day. And often the most easy person to get hold of is the person who has the experience in spinning things, who has a whole apparatus behind them and is able to tell that story convincingly, to push propaganda effectively. So I think the practicalities for journalists are really difficult. And I think that speaks to what you were saying, Raggy, about the shrinkage of foreign correspondents. There are fewer people who are paid to live in places these days. There's a lot more parachute journalism. It's a job that has changed dramatically even in the 25 years that I've been involved in it.
Yeah, correct.
The one thing I'd sort of say is that sometimes I can't help but sort of feel, you know, as you were saying, Jeremy, about sort of Gaza, independent access is absolutely vital. And we've sometimes been our own worst enemy. I think embedding was a absolutely terrible, awful thing in the Iraq War.
Can you explain what embedding is?
Okay, embedding is the idea that you literally travel with and are utterly dependent on an armed force that is part of a war. So you travel with them, you report from their reality, you film with them, and when they go, you can't stay there, you have to sort of leave. And the idea in Iraq was that there was, you know, Saddam Hussein's sort of army, and then there was the US and British sort of forces. So if you want to get access to the battlefield, you either take the risk of being in the middle and so therefore getting shot up and killed, or you travel with us and you report from our sort of thing. And I think what that did is that it sort of ate away at the idea of journalistic neutrality. And every single armed conflict since then has copied that copybook. I mean, that's what you're saying about Gaza, effectively, is that if you know, in order to get access...
The only way you go is with the IDF. We don't... I've been in once, with one day with the IDF in the first month, and northern Gaza, I know Gaza quite well. So Paul Morris recognised where I was. Even after a month, it was a wasteland. So goodness knows what it's like now.
I agree completely on embeds. I mean, they started in Vietnam, was the first time they were embeds, and then, but the Iraq was the first time they were rolled out kind of strategically. I didn't cover the war as an embed. I was what we called unilaterals, which was a slightly strange term, but independently covering it. But I later, actually, because I'd been reporting for so long on the civilian story, I thought, I felt obligated to see the American side of the story, more so asked to be embedded, and went to an embed in Saddam Hussein's palace in Tikrit. And after a few days there, it was at the time when they were looking for Saddam Hussein, so these dawn raids were happening everywhere, and I went on a dawn raid with the army, and we went to a house somewhere out in the sticks, and they, you know, knocked down the doors, brought all the men outside, treated the family really badly, looking for weapons. And I felt so deeply uncomfortable as a journalist. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was doing my job observing and reporting on it. I was utterly free to report on it in any way I wanted. I didn't have to bring any, you know, bias to it. But I was arriving with them in an American army vehicle with an American helmet on. And to me, that felt like complicity. It felt like crossing a line. And I actually asked to leave that embed the next day. I felt that was a line crossed as a journalist.
I think sometimes there are issues about the compromises you have to make. Yeah. So it's not just in that situation with an embed, because you're trading access, a certain degree of access, for a loss of independence. Because when the boot's on the other foot, I mean, you were in Iraq, I was in Iraq, you were in Iraq in the days of the Saddam Hussein regime. We were strictly regulated, and subsequently I spent ages in the war in Syria reporting from the Assad side, from the regime side. When the uprising started in 2011 in Libya, I found myself once again in the enemy capital being bombed by my own side, but then again, you know, dealing with a dictatorship, and to sort of lift the curtain, you have to accept really quite serious restrictions sometimes in where you can go. I mean, there was one veteran reporter in the Middle East who used to say the first rule of journalism in Gaddafi's Libya is don't get on the bus. And I thought that, and I knew about this, and I went there, and I thought, I'm not going to get on the bloody bus. The only choice you had to get to places was to get on the bus, or you'd leave the hotel and get arrested, and they'd bring you back. You know, it was okay for us as representative of the Western media. Our guys from BBC, well, non-Westerners, say for BBC Arabic, got a very rough time when they got arrested. We just would be, you know, we'd try like kids trying to escape, and they would bring us back. I mean, it was like a game, but no. So that's the problem. So that sort of brings with it to a whole raft of, and then they have the power of you, which is the visa. I was expelled from Iraq once in the 90s because I offended someone in the Ministry of Information. And I gave them, I used to write quite carefully, but I gave this guy, I'd fallen out with him during the first Gulf War. Uday. Yeah, you remember him. Horrible man. And I'd fallen out with him in the first Gulf War, and then in mid-90s, by then he'd risen up the firmament. And I just gave him something in a piece. I wrote things carefully, which I thought was fairly, but of course there was a lot of elephants in the room we didn't deal with. But even when I started hinting there might be an elephant who'd possibly been in the room once, i.e. this was a brutal dictatorship, they gave us 5 hours to get to the border. It took 6 hours, 7 hours to get to the border. The sound man nearly had a heart attack saying, what if we don't get there in time? I said, we'll be fine. But no, so they use things like visas and access then equally to try to control what you do. It's all about trying to control.
We've touched on this, and I want to come to Fiona on this a bit more, especially with working with Reporters Without Borders. Can you tell us a bit more about the kinds of pressures that journalists face in different places? I think we all can imagine the regimes, the dictatorships where these kinds of things take place, but where is it happening more subtly? What kind of pressures does that put on journalists? And again, especially to cover these conflicts in a way that's independent, that's fair, and true to what's actually happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that pressures on journalism worldwide are increasing year on year. The number of journalists being forced into exile is huge. At RSF last year, I think it was around 60% of our total funds, maybe even higher, were to support journalists who needed to leave their country urgently for reasons of safety. So yeah, Jeremy mentioned visas. This happens all the time. So either stopping people from going in or chucking people back out. There's a whole sort of playbook that's used against journalists. And I think one of the things that might be interesting to share is that it doesn't only happen in countries where there is an active conflict or where there is, a clear dictatorship. Right here in London, Iranian journalists in exile are being targeted horrendously every single day. Someone was stabbed, an Iranian journalist was stabbed a few months ago in a London street in broad daylight outside his house. The case is currently going through the Old Bailey. And that is authoritarian regimes reaching across their borders to their journalists wherever they are. Why? Because, as you say, it's all about controlling the narrative. Those Iranian language journalists here, for example, would be writing for audiences back home or broadcasting for audiences back home, and that's exactly what the aim is to stop them. So there's a really, there's a massive range of tools that are used, right from killing journalists all the way through to digital attacks, which we see more and more, online harassment, online abuse, threats, hacking. So there's an enormous and growing playbook, I think, that's being used.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, journalism is not a puritanical, ethos, and it is a series of compromises. But when you make the compromises, does that still allow you to peel the curtain back? So I think you're absolutely right.
That's the dilemma, and that's really the balancing act. And I think you need to be pretty transparent about what it is you can't do. But then, when we went in the years of the 90s during sanctions, we went to Iraq under Saddam, you'd have to go to the press center. You go to the press center and give them a list of requests that you'd like to do. And there were things that you'd ask for. I'd like to visit a nuclear installation. No way. I'd like to interview the president. Well, maybe one day. I'd like to go to the Saddam Hussein Children's Hospital to see children dying. Yes, when should we go? And the fact is, they were dying because of sanctions in huge numbers. But it was only part of it. But whenever I needed to do something, can I see again the hunger caused? Yes, of course. Look, in this room we have a child with malnutrition. And
it does happen the other way, though, as well. I mean, I remember being in Kabul and just managing to get a sort of visa in the sort of last dying days of the Taliban in 2001. And I had one of those old sat phones. Yes. And the best thing that happened to it was that I was given this sat phone and I had to sort of put it in a sort of car battery and it blew up. So I didn't have any means of communication other than going to the Intercontinental Hotel in Kabul. And then I did one telephone interview and I called the then sort of, foreign editor of the BBC. And I said, I told them before, we're going to have a certain press secretary of the Prime Minister at the time, you're going to have an Alistair Campbell call. And I did the first interview, as a sort of BBC correspondent reporting from there, and, picked up the phone. Well done, Raggy. Yes, we've had the Alistair Campbell call already. So it does that sort of pressure, manipulation, comes from all angles, is what I'm sort of saying.
Absolutely.
Is it? And
absolutely. No one is pure in this.
Exactly. No, there's
no one's
exactly.
pure.
Exactly.
Jeremy, if I can press on this idea of compromise too, because we've been talking about telling civilian stories, I think the do-good side of journalism. You've also interviewed people who are warlords, dictators, who had some very high-profile
Yes.
interviews, Gaddafi, Assad. Can you tell us about how you approach those and kind of the moral dilemmas there of giving voice to people who are on the other side of these conflicts?
My main thing is you have to be, I think, during the height of the war in Syria, I interviewed Assad, Bashar, when he was in quite some trouble. It was before the Russians really intervened properly in 2015. And the large areas of the suburbs of Damascus were in the hands of rebels. You could hear the war from the presidential palace when I was in there. And I interviewed Gaddafi along with a couple of other valued, trusted colleagues when the uprising started against him. And my thing has always been, you need to really challenge them. You've got to ask all the hard questions. You must be seen also to challenge them. In terms of when you put the edit together, it's very important, I think, to be seen to be challenging them. Bashar al-Assad, for example, and it was the third time I'd interviewed him, because I'd interviewed him a couple of times before the war started. And he was extraordinarily polite in a really old-fashioned kind of way. He'd leap up when you entered the room and, beautiful manners. I'm sure, your mother would be delighted if you brought him home. And, not really, of course. And so I said to him at the beginning, because he'd take you off, in each of the interviews, he took you off for about 10, 15 minutes of private time beforehand, and you'd chat about stuff. And I said to him, look, and we were, he's very polite. I said, look, Mr. President, you need to know, I'm going to ask you the hardest questions I can think of. And ask whatever you like, it's going to be fine. I said, I'm really going to ask you, I will try not to be rude, because I tend not to be a rude interviewer, but I'm going to be very firm. Plus, we'd agreed that we would run at least one version in toto. There was a long negotiation beforehand about the terms and conditions, and our slot was 23 minutes, so it had to be maximum 23 minutes. And anyway, so I drove it through. We'd war gamed it, and it went pretty well. And he's trying to make stupid jokes about barrel bombs and things like that, which really made him look bad. I was happy with that. We used part of that. And I was challenging him in the course of all that. At the very end of it, he said, that was good. I enjoyed that. We'll do it again. And his press secretary, a woman called Luna, who was killed in mysterious circumstances last year, in the last months of the regime, he was furious. Absolutely furious, and she never, ever answered one email of mine again, so I never had another chance. I barely got a visa after that, actually. Got a couple of them. And the one other thing I want to say, in terms of manipulation, before the interview, the deal was that we would run the whole interview, but we would then be able to cut down versions. Of course, you'd have to. You can't always run 23 minutes. And choose clips. And Luna summoned me to the palace a day or so before the scheduled interview. And it was a big deal, this interview. For them too, it was going to be on Syrian TV. And she used all her charm to say, Jeremy, there's one thing I want to do, and that's to be and help you choose the clips. I said, what? Be in the room, in the edit room. Yeah. And she was very charming woman, put it that way. And she leant over, put her hand on my knee and said, you know, we'll have dinner later. And, very proper, but you know, there was, I felt, oof, the wattage was. I said, Luna, it's going to be a disaster. Well, we will not do that. We won't do it because, to start with, it completely negates what we're trying to do here. And also I tried to argue with her and said, look, the fact is, it'll make you look bad too once it leaks out. She said, I've done it with all the guys who've done interviews with Assad, and believe you me, it'll be our secret. And I said, you have got to be joking. It's not. So it all got very serious, and she said, well, there's not going to be an interview then. And I said, fine. And I went back to the hotel, and we had a team there. They built a set. It was a big deal. And I nearly threw up. I was so, oh my God, we're so close and yet so far. But she was trying it on. About midnight, I got a call from her number 2. Luna never spoke to me again, saying, Ms. Luna has thought again, and yes, we'll stick to the original agreement. I mean, she was trying it on. But the point is, I mean, the pressure, that kind of thing, is non-stop. But so it was very important to try and be as independent as you could, to ask all the bad questions, to be as rude, not rude, as firm. I don't believe in being rude in interviews, being firm. And that's the way I think you have to deal with dealing with a dictator. Quite a few people have said to me, oh, weren't you scared? I wasn't even slightly scared. Why would you be? There's no reason why you'd be scared. You've been invited. It's not scary. Scary is some out-of-control guy at a checkpoint with a loaded weapon. That's scary. The head of state in the presidential palace with 4 cameras in the room is not scary.
I do want to come to audience questions in just a moment, so I'll ask just one more that I'll pose to Fiona. We've talked a lot, obviously, about this very fast-moving media landscape. I think we were talking in the green room before, the challenges of social media, and I think an assumption that the echo chambers, the fake news, all this is having just such a negative effect. And yet also we hear in places where it is difficult for journalists, this idea of having citizen journalists, of having people being able to create the TikTok videos, that it's actually democratized media in many ways and has allowed a lot of voices from conflict zones to be heard that wouldn't otherwise. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that tension, and then we'll turn to audience questions.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, social media in particular, but technology more broadly, has sort of democratized journalism in the sense that it's made it the barrier to access much lower, and that's really positive in lots of ways. I would, though, first give a shout out to all the professional journalists who are doing incredible jobs. You know, we've been speaking a lot about our experiences as foreign correspondents, but the people who bear the brunt of reporting conflict are local journalists from those countries, which speaks to what you were saying, Raggy, about how hard it is when you're from a place and have to cover what's happening in your own communities. And they do an extraordinary job, often in absolutely unbearable circumstances, and continue to do so. I think that citizen journalism has enabled us to see, thinking from a sort of audience perspective, corners of conflicts that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to get to. I think it's really helpful for us as professional journalists to be able to gather information in those kinds of ways, where there are countries which are completely closed off. There are some exceptions where there aren't even citizen journalists able to act, but for Syria would be a good example of certain areas of the country where for a long time we were entirely reliant on people being able to package their own videos. Gaza is another good example where there's been some extraordinary sort of citizen contributions. The job of journalism then, though, is to take all that and objectively look at it and find the story within it and analyze and bring expertise to it. So I see them as complementary but slightly different roles, I think.
The one thing I'd sort of say to everyone here, when you switch on your, TV report, whatever channel you're sort of watching, is we call them fixers. But actually they save our lives. They give us the lifeblood of sort of, journalism. They're drivers, translators, the whole gamut. And every report that we do has an army of people who really do make it all happen.
It's the first link in the chain.
Yeah.
In Ukraine, we work with very good local journalists who have got the connections with the various brigades and the armed units. which you require now to get access. At the beginning of the war, you could basically turn up somewhere. When a war starts, especially something like that, when there's an invasion and there's a period, it's something of a golden period for journalists, actually, where you can just turn up, you can meet people yourself, you can be free. But the death knell to that is when they start organizing themselves, and then they give you an ID card and accreditation, and then you have to start getting permissions. And so in Ukraine, we rely on Ukrainian journalists who, they're hired, they work for us, they're there the whole time, people like me go in and out, and so they build relationships. They know all the different people they need, they know who to call. And
when not to go some places.
Yeah,
sure. Not, roads that don't feel safe, they'll tell you, and you don't have a clue.
Absolutely, and I mean that's kind of joint thing that we all have. And no, it's vital. It's a very good point, Raggy. I mean, I think that without that local expertise, we'd probably barely leave the hotel.
Great. Well, I do want to make sure we get to our audience questions. So I think we'll turn first to several of our expert guests who are in the audience. I think Tony Borden, the director of the Institute of War and Peace Reporting, is here in the front row. So, Tony.
Hi, thanks very much to the panel for your input, and Chairman, nice to see you, and all. I guess picking up from you, you remember a long time ago, a shell lands in the center of Sarajevo, and of course, the Bosnians shelled themselves. And
They did it the whole time, apparently.
and take it many years, it felt like a real deja vu, because we met one of those evenings. You had just left Bucha, and of course, the Ukrainians had planted the bodies themselves. So in one sense, nothing changes, but the discussion is disagreeing well. How over this time would you think that the disagreement really, well, the phrase we use is disinformation, but really a better phrase is active measures, or maybe even a better phrase is narrative warfare. This is really a serious game. It's not disagreement, it's lies and damn lies. It's warfare through information, and it has a really terribly damaging effect, which you see. So I guess my question from your perspective is, how have you seen this change over the time in these many conflicts that you've experienced? How has disinformation become more noxious, more powerful, or do you feel really it's the same game, different day?
Who wants to go first?
I think it's the same game, different day. You can go back to Vietnam. It took perhaps 20, 30 years after that to reveal the lies and damn lies that were available there. It's a cliche. Journalism is the first draft of history. Sometimes it's totally crap. Sometimes you've been misled. Sometimes you've allowed your own naivety to get in the way. But I don't think anything has sort of changed in any of the sort of conflicts. And every party to a conflict is using the weaponization of information. That's my view.
I agree. I don't think it's something new. I think we can trace, if you want to talk about fake news, it goes back, to the end of the 20th century, whenever you like. I think the things that have changed, though, are, again, coming back to technology, but the ability to spread that disinformation very quickly and very powerfully. And linked to that, just the information overload that audiences have today is very different and changes the way that we interact with information. It's much harder. I mean, if you look at the statistics on how many, gigs of information we take in every day now compared to 20 years ago, it's phenomenal. And I think that makes it very difficult for people watching or listening or reading news to sift through everything and immediately understand what is real and what isn't. So I don't think the existence of disinformation is anything new. I think it's been used in similar ways through history. But I do think its potential for damage now is greater than ever, and that makes it more dangerous.
Yeah, I agree with that, because it's the speed of communication, the ubiquity of sources of information. I started the BBC 41 years ago, and then we had this thing which I thought was wonderful, where a cuttings library, news information, where you'd ring up and they would give you all the recent cuttings on a particular thing, and you get them within an hour. I could not believe the speed and the efficiency of this service. You get a big envelope full of photocopies. I mean, now everyone's got 1 million times more things than that on their phone at any given moment. And so that's, I think, it does make those, for those people who want to spread untruths, it makes it easier for them to do it. And the other thing I think that really strikes me with this is that because, say 24-hour worldwide TV didn't exist once, actually. It didn't exist when I started. And so you could be relatively anonymous sometimes, especially as for the BBC. If you're a TV reporter and the TV stuff was on in Britain, no one knew who the hell you were. If you were the BBC World Service correspondent, a lot of people would know your name. They might not know. I was mistaken in Kabul in about late 80s, or no, early 90s, for Lise Doucette, Canadian female, esteemed colleague, because they would read out her dispatches on the Pashtun service, and of course they didn't know whether Lise was a boy's name or a girl's name, frankly. And so, you at least, no, I'm not Lise. But it was not a bad thing. They were happy to see me, Lise. But now, things are different. And I think that's one of the factors that makes life as a journalist more dangerous. Because journalists are more targeted, because it's a way of influencing the media landscape. The media battlefield is really important in war, and particularly in asymmetric wars, the wars of the weak against the strong. Because even if the strong side is winning and killing loads of fighters and civilians, it just takes one bomb in one place from the weak side to have this huge, disproportionate impact on people's perceptions of how the war's going. And sometimes journalists who get mixed up in this, therefore, become targets. I have much more of a sense now of journalists being targets than I did more than 30 years ago when I started doing reporting from hazardous environments.
I might take another question from Edna Fernandez, who is the executive director and co-founder of Beyond Conflict.
Hi, thank you very much for an amazing presentation so far. You've spoken really eloquently about the challenges of delivering the story whilst protecting yourselves and your team. I wondered if you could talk a bit about the toll it takes on your mental well-being, getting these stories year in, year out, decade in, decade out. And the reason I ask is because our charity, we provide mental health support to victims of war, but also the frontline workers in war zones. So we hear a lot about the impact that echoes down whole generations, really, because the mental health toll side is not addressed.
Who's going to go first? I'll go, if you like. I think it affects your whole life. When I joined the BBC, if I had any ambition, I thought I might want to be Washington correspondent. I thought I might do a few conflicts. I never thought that 41 years later, I would be basically spending much of my time in either Ukraine or the Middle East, and having reported on more than 20 wars, and many, I've been physically hurt, I've been shot. Colleagues of mine have been killed while I've been with them. And the mental effect of that, I think I can honestly say, I think it shaped my entire life, my attitudes to things. I think this is not a job you leave at the end of the day. It's with you the whole time. You follow things the whole time. And it's not just, I hate the phrase war correspondent and things like that. It's just that I think that there's a very turbulent world. And if you're reporting from often the biggest stories, they're often these days violent and dangerous. And it has affected my own, after my colleague Abba Takush was killed by the Israelis in 2000 when I was with him, and they tried to kill me and the correspondent, and the cameraman as well. We know this because the guy from the Times was listening to their radio traffic. We've got one of them with a tank shell. They put a tank shell through the back of his car. We'll get the other two with a heavy machine gun. And when I wanted to go up to where he was, because he had fought his way out of the burning car, and Malik, the cameraman, said, Jeremy, he's dead. You can't help him, and they will kill you. This was a guy who worked many years in Lebanon, a Lebanese guy. And after 10 minutes, I couldn't bear it, and I thought I'd go out and push out a bit, and they immediately opened up with a heavy machine gun on us. And luckily, we weren't shot. So after that, I had some symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. I had some good interventions. I never developed the syndrome, the whole thing. However, I had things like hypervigilance. When I came back to see a counselor in London, I was living in Jerusalem at the time. I found myself in the taxi queue in the station. I think I got the train I was in Paddington Station, and from the airport. And working out where I found myself working out safe places to stand in case shelling started. Not totally healthy situation to be in. Later on, I had a severe depressive disorder for a while. I couldn't work for a while. And now, I think my mental health is good. I'm robust, I'm strong, I've been through a lot. And I think, actually, to be a foreign correspondent in a dangerous place, you have to be resilient. And I say to, again, younger colleagues, I say to them, look, it's not always going to be fun if you want to do this sorts of work, and you have to be resilient. You have to realize that sometimes you've got to suck it up. And also, it's not about you. It's about the people you're reporting on. So it's not an easy thing to do. But no, I think that some colleagues I remember they used to say to me, older people, they say, I'm like a doctor, I'm completely dispassionate. And I think either these people totally lack empathy if you say something like that, and you cannot be a good reporter if you're not empathetic, or they were lying. I'm more sensitized to things now than I was when I wasn't very experienced. I've got 40 years of experience. I've seen a lot of stuff. And I think my skin is thinner now than it's probably ever been. However, I'm also very determined in my reporting that the thinness of my skin and my outrage or lack of it, or the feelings I might have about a story, is not the issue. That's not what we're there for. We have to try and tell the story of other people. Again, it's a bit of a balancing act, but it's also, people are very aware of it at this time. And certainly 40 years ago, you could be joking. Have a drink, boy. Suck it up.
Yeah, definitely. It's changed a lot.
Yeah.
I think, at RSF, we have centers we have a center in Ukraine, for example, for press, one in Lebanon, because we're not able to open one in Gaza, but for that region, we've got one in Myanmar. And one of the things we always offer journalists is psychosocial support, because it's clearly covering these kinds of things has an enormous impact. I think it has an impact from a trauma perspective, which you've touched on definitely. Also in terms of shaping your perspective as to sort of how you see the world and how you understand what's important and what's not. Some of that's really positive in terms of how you can sort of understand in your own life what really matters and what doesn't. I think the thing that is difficult for journalists as opposed to victims of war who, civilians caught up in war is, and you touched on this, Jeremy, but is the fact that you're there to cover the story of people who have to be there. And you feel quite privileged to be doing that. You also have a responsibility as a journalist to do it professionally. And you touched on it earlier, actually, Raghi, but leaving those places is really, really hard. I always found that an enormous emotional wrench, to feel how lucky I was to be able to get on a plane at the end, and that you're leaving people to ongoing bombardment or attack. And I think that makes it hard on an emotional level, but also hard to seek help sometimes for many journalists, I think, because you always have this sense, it's not that bad for me compared to what it's like for some other people. And I think that sort of slightly distinguishes the kind of mental impact on journalists as opposed to on other people who are caught up in war zones. The same probably applies to medics, and it wouldn't just be to journalists, but I think that's a slightly different factor.
I think the cultural landscape in terms of journalists confronting the damage to their mental health has changed out of all recognition, and that's been one of the most positive things about the transformation of this industry. The ability to say you need help, and for organizations actually to build it into their whole sort of system has completely sort of changed. So I think that's been
it's healthy.
It's a very healthy thing.
Great. I'd like to welcome one more question from Rachel Younger, who's an ITV news correspondent.
Thank you. I suppose this touches on how the emotional landscape has changed. I started international reporting maybe not quite so long ago as you, Jeremy, but a good 20 years ago at Sky News. And I was told very clearly that I should be as dispassionate as possible and simply say what I saw without fear or favour. And that was very much the training. But since then, things have changed. And now I speak to a lot of my much younger colleagues who are used to living their lives online and who feel that if we don't show more of ourselves and more emotion, then people will turn to other providers on the news, influencers, people who are willing to show their vulnerabilities and how they're affected by the news. So I'm curious because, Jeremy, you can remember a time when you weren't recognised. But how much of ourselves should we show as reporters in order to continue to be trustworthy, authentic sources at a time when fake news is shouted at us more than ever?
Great, thank you.
I'll go first. Thank you, Rachel. Nice to see you. That's a very, very good question. I suppose I'm sort of in that sort of generation which cut their teeth in a culture where you did not put yourself as the center of the sort of, not the center of the story, but to reveal yourself in any way. You'd let the pictures and the sounds and the interviews do that for you. And I'm still probably stuck in that sort of world still. I don't really pay much attention to social media. I should do a lot more. I think that in a turbulent world, yes, you can go on, social media and TikTok and so forth, but there is always a coming together of, global events, national events. You always will go and search for something that you feel is authentic and, I hate the word objective, I'm not going to use it, as dispassionate and real and puts the events that are happening center stage. So I don't think there's any cut through with influencers or so forth in our sort of industry. I still do think it's about reporters who are there to try and, despite all of our flaws, all of our views and prejudices and feelings, to try and tell the story as well as we can.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I'm from a generation that was brought up very much, you do not write stories about yourself, you're never the story. I taught journalism more recently and had a constant battle with my students who wanted only to write about themselves or one or two topics. Yeah, they're really, really interesting. And I, even after years of, battling with them in the classroom, I absolutely still feel that it's very important that journalism is clear, especially now when it's coming under such pressure from all sides, that we know what we are doing as journalists, and that job is to say what we see. It doesn't have to be complicated. At the end of the day, we report, we listen, we watch, we speak to people, and we report on it as dispassionately as possible. And I think we have to be really clear-minded that that's what we're there to do. Let the influencers do what they want. I hope in a very crowded information space that we are not going to utterly lose sight of the need for independent, reliable news. It's what my job now is all about, is defending that. Because without it, our democracies aren't going to be able to last. Free press and a reliable, independent press is absolutely essential to civic participation in democratic life. So I would say, let's hope that journalism keeps a clear vision of what it's actually there for.
I mean, what I would say to people who might want to report on their own feelings about a story is you're welcome, but that's not journalism. Exactly. It's something else. It's about what you think. And that's, maybe there's a place for that. Yeah. And you can do a great TikTok or whatever on social media, or write an erudite thing for The Atlantic, but on a very personal level. I mean, there is a place for that, but it's not on the mainstream news media. Certainly not, and any of the ones that we've worked for, I would say. And why do I say that? It's because I think that if we have any kind of credibility, and, you know, as I say that, I'm conscious that, of course, a lot of people do not believe us anymore. And we are very, very aware of this. And we're also very aware, all media organizations are very aware of the fact that younger audiences, you know, there's always the holy grail to get the younger audience on the basis that if you get them young, you've got them for life. That's the hope. And when there's a lot of skepticism about the mainstream media, then so what are we trying to do about it? Well, we are trying to expose more the way we do things. You know, it used to be someone might do a media piece. This is how the media are gathering their stuff, and it was considered rather indulgent and not wholly. There was one CNN reporter, they used to have a slot on CNN where they would show sort of behind the camera, and you could always tell when he was doing one of those, because he'd do his piece to camera carrying the tripod on his shoulder, and it was, oh, I thought he was doing that thing again, isn't he? He's looking at the media. But now what we're trying to do is actually build it in more into the main event. Not so much, well, gosh, it was hard getting there, but more, these are the constraints that we face. And I think that's one way to try and be a little bit more authentic. I think we're authentic anyway, but show our authenticity. But it's a constant challenge. I actually think that this is actually a great time for the mainstream media, even though for many people that phrase is like uttering the name of the devil, because there is so much information in the world that I think that people, if they want to decode it and find a way through it, they need to find a media provider, whether it be a website, newspaper, you know, the New York Times, ITV, CNN, whoever, the BBC even, who will help them through it and help people to cut through the chaff. Because that's the thing now, there is so much out there. I think people do need some assistance. So that's the kind of argument I've been trying to make. Don't know if it works, but...
Jeremy, you mentioned trying to be more transparent about the processes and the decisions. So I think that leads us nicely into some of our absolutely fantastic audience questions. So thank you to everyone who has submitted. Florence asked a really great question that got a lot of people asking about the terminology decisions that are made in journalism, and a lot of questions about Gaza, about Israel-Palestine. So again, numerous questions, the decision between using the term prisoners for Palestinians versus hostages, the decision between saying war, conflict, genocide, any other number of options, the decision to say militant versus terrorist, all these questions of terminology. How do you decide? Who decides? Can you unpack that for us a little bit more?
Shall I start? Yeah. Sorry? I decide what the story is. But in the BBC, we have some rules about the general way we use terms. We are very, very conscious, as I think all responsible journalists are, of the power of words and the way that some words help and inform and elucidate, and some that add to the confusion and to the obfuscation and the fog that lies around some things. And, you know, I was grasped this nettle of terrorist, for example. It's not true that we don't use the word, but I would use the word quoting others, because I don't think it's particularly helpful. Because you look at the way the word terrorist is used around the world. I mean, Donald Trump calls all sorts of people terrorists. He's reclassified some people as terrorist groups so he can find it easier to expel them from the United States. My view is you should describe what happens. You should describe, maybe they bust into a house and kill people. So describe it. Describe what happens. Because the point is that people perceive these things really differently. And the number of Palestinians who'd say, vast numbers, vast majority of the ones I've ever met, who would say that Israel regularly carries out acts of terrorism against their people, either state terrorism or state terrorism by settlers, for example, or individual acts of terrorism by settlers. At the same time, we get an enormous amount of flack for not calling Hamas terrorists. In the House of Commons, people stand up and say things. Of course, we would use those quotations from the Israelis. The Israelis say that, terrorists from Hamas have done this or that or the other. But I don't think, for me, the most important thing is to use things that make it clearer, not more complicated, and don't get you involved in a great row about who's who. So that's why I think that you need to be careful about using certain words, certain descriptions. And certainly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, my goodness me, the number of minefields that there are, the way that, for example, people refer to the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, not East Jerusalem and the occupied West Bank, because of course East Jerusalem is also occupied, and large areas of what is now East Jerusalem were actually part of the West Bank until Israel changed the borders after they annexed the area in 1967. So there's loads of words, and so we have style guides about this. There's a lot of internal debate about not just the big beast words like terrorist, but more subtle measurements about use of words. And the other one that's often talked about is the word genocide. Genocide. I have, in my reporting, I'm very happy and have said it's quite clear from what's been going on that there are acts which amount to war crimes happening. I mean, they haven't been convicted of anything at this stage. I mean, I testified 4 times at the former Yugoslavia War Crimes Tribunal, and they convicted people of war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity. So I think you need to, we're not the judge and jury, but I think by describing things that are happening, it's sometimes plain as a pikestaff. Now, genocide is a bit difficult because of legally is a very high bar in terms of it's about proving intent to destroy a population in part or in whole. And so the strong argument that the argument Israel makes strongly in Gaza is that they are acting in self-defense. Any country would do it. These people attacked us.
Jeremy, you're a liar. It is a genocide, and you should call it what it is.
Yeah, look, I'm saying if you listen to what I'm saying, you might have noticed that I was quoting the Israelis on that. I mean,
You should not be platforming war criminals.
I'm not platforming anybody who's a war criminal. I'm telling you something. And what people need...
Thank you for your
What
intervention.
people need to understand is the different views on all sides. So clearly on the other side, there are other views.
Killing children and journalists.
Excuse me, thank you for sharing your intervention. Your voice has been heard, and we want to hear from the panelists and from other questions as well.
I'm not denying what's going on there. I'm talking about the way that people describe it. The International Court of Justice is investigating the case brought by South Africa of genocide, and we've reported that, and I used the word on air. But it's going to take them quite a while to come to a conclusion on that. And I'm trying to use it in the legal sense, because I do not want to be because I'm not part of the war and the political discussion of it.
Thank you. You've been able to comment. I'd like to give our other panelists a chance to respond to this question of terminology.
Yeah, just to say that I think journalists can often get caught in a sort of web of accusations from all sides. And this particular conflict, the Gaza conflict, has been one of the most difficult for journalism, but also beyond. And this isn't just in the UK either. These kinds of discussions are happening all around the world, wherever we see journalists reporting on it. But taking a step out of that conflict, I think vocabulary is a really interesting thing to raise. I think also often if you're looking for unconscious biases, which definitely exist in media all around the world, vocabulary is one part of the story, but it's also things like who gets quoted, which sources are more prevalent, who are you representing your stories. I would say that 9 times out of 10, these aren't deliberate decisions. They're things that happen on the ground because of time, because of who you can access, because of really practical considerations. So the idea that journalists have somehow sort of tried to shape a narrative, often actually, if you trace the source, comes from politicians who point the finger at journalists. And that's a really dangerous political rhetoric. Again, getting back to kind of what the essential job that journalists are doing is to say what happens. We're not there to make decisions about who's right or who's wrong, or, you know, sort of trace greater arcs of history. We're writing that very rough first draft of history and saying things as we see them. So I think, yeah, I think often it's not sort of a concern.
I just wonder sometimes why certain conflicts become a magnet for people's, you know. I did a report a couple of weeks ago on Sudan. It is the largest displacement crisis in the world. 11 million people have been displaced all over the country. It's the largest sexual violence crisis in the world. There has been the attempt to eradicate an entire people in Darfur. No one shouts genocide or, you know, crimes or anything else. So, you know, why does that not matter as much as sort of? So it's that sort of projection that some things, as we all know, Israel-Palestine just becomes an entire magnet where everybody's, you know, feelings and grievances and passions get. No one gives a shit about Sudan, and it is by far and away the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. But no one's here is shouting genocide or anything else.
Handily answered one of our questions from Livy, who did ask about this question of implicit bias. Why don't we hear more about Sudan, the Congo, other conflict areas? So, and people who haven't seen Ragi's segment on Sudan, please watch it. It's extremely important right now.
You know, it comes back to the things we've been sort of talking about. It's about sort of access. It's about colonial history. You know, this country is, you know, deeply involved in the history of Palestine and Israel. It's also deeply involved in sort of Sudan. But, you know, Sudan is the largest, was until South Sudan separated, the largest country in Africa. I once went to report from Darfur, which is one province of Sudan. It's the size of France. And there were, I think, 3,000 Rwandan peacekeepers. Imagine 3,000 peacekeepers in sort of Sudan. So I guess there are just sort of, you know, inherent, what word, biases. I mean, where, you know, we work for Western media organizations, and the West is focused on certain things. And so inevitably, things that make it onto the news agenda are driven by that, and other things don't, you know, get on. But it's also just practical things about.
Oh, it's about access.
Access, yeah.
And also commercial interests in the sense that journalism is an industry. And, you know, if I think back to when I was a young reporter at Reuters, based in that region, when the Darfur crisis first kicked off, we were covering the North-South war in Sudan at the time and heard from, as often happens in the first instance, from aid agencies who were there about this growing crisis in Darfur, which turned into a huge story. But trying to convince head office that it was worth spending the money, which was a lot because it was really hard to get there because of access considerations, was hard. Eastern Congo was always hard to get to. Seychelles we always tried to get to, and they were never having any of it. But, you know, we were trying to find places. Yeah, I know, we were always trying to cover the elections in Seychelles, and the answer was always, no one cares about the elections in Seychelles. Right? We do. But yeah, I think all those interests are at play as well. And I think if audiences were more interested in those things, it would be easier for us to make the arguments to have the ability to.
Let's go back to the issue of Gaza and access to Gaza. I think that so when October the 7th, I was in Ukraine, and we immediately moved, and October the 7th was a Saturday, and by the Monday afternoon, I was in Ashkelon, which is the nearest big Israeli town to Gaza, I was basically there until the end of the year, pretty much. And as I said earlier, I only got into Gaza once with the army. And that was sort of interesting, useful, because it gave me an idea of the level of destruction at that point. Now, early on, in the first couple of days, when the Israelis were going into those border communities, they took us in with them. The IDF took us in. So, for example, I was in the kibbutz Kfar Aza when they were still shooting. They were still clearing buildings. The paratroopers there were still going from house to house, firing at things, and they were the dead Hamas guys were lying rotting on the grass. Weather was very hot. They were still taking out the bodies of Israelis and body bags from the buildings. Now, why did the Israelis allow us to do that? Because they wanted us to see it. It was important for us to see it. It was great to get the access in a news sense, but it also, from their perspective, it told their story. Now, this is my feeling.
If you let me finish, I was about to get on to that.
Everyone, the comments have been made. We'd like to finish this event. Thank you. Many. We have a.
If you let me finish.
For.
Hey,
We would like to finish the event. Thank you for your intervention. Your voice has been heard. Your voice has been heard. We have an event that we are trying to finish with several minutes left. The message has been heard loud and clear.
Look, I mean, if you let me finish, what I was about to say.
If we're not able to allow the guests to answer, we are going to need to ask you to leave.
What's this? Is this session meant to be people disagreeing agreeably or something?
I think the voice has been heard, and we are going to.
No, sorry, I want to finish the point I made, which is really.
I want Jeremy to finish.
The point that I was making was the reason why the Israelis don't allow people like us in there is because there's loads of things that they've done that they don't want us to see.
They don't want it to be freely reported. Yes, and as I've said, we work with Palestinians who can do that, but I do think that having the full ability to broadcast in granular detail from people who are on the ground, I think that helps greatly in terms.
Okay, your voice has been heard.
But your Palestinian journalists are great. We rely on them completely.
Journalists and sources every single day. How many Palestinian sources do you have?
At this point, I'm afraid we are going to have to end our event. I thank all of you who came and listened to our speakers. I thank our speakers immensely, Jeremy, Fiona, and Lagi.
So that's great. Yeah.
And our co-host and president, Michael Spence, will say a few words.
So it's my job to thank the panelists, and I'm going to do that. And I'm going to do it for a very particular reason. And that is because I think amidst all the shouting, it's really important that we listen to one another, and that we cling to reason and to fact. One of the things we've talked a lot about in the Disagreeing Well program is the importance of epistemic humility, the importance of admitting that you might be wrong. And again from the panelists today, I heard them talk about the limitations of their perspectives. I heard them talk about the difficulties of bias. I heard them talk about the difficulties of dealing with different perspectives. And yet again and again, I heard a relentless commitment to the search for truth, an unwillingness to give up on words like dispassionate or balanced, or even, problematic though the word might be, objective. And I think that that is something for which we all should be extremely grateful, and particularly at the personal cost and courage that we've heard about this afternoon. Well, you know, Jeremy, we are very proud of you as a UCL alumnus, and I know that news channels are always chasing for younger audiences. When I said tonight who I was meeting, my wife said, make sure you get a picture for our 6-year-old because he thinks Jeremy Boehm is pretty cool. And so I would ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to stand one more time to give a round of applause for this remarkable panel. Thank you very much. Thank you.